I've been here my whole life, so I remember as the crack epidemic came in and the violence kind of was on a consistent surge, that kind of created the detriment with mass incarceration and jaded opportunities for people in this community, and that cycle has just continued to spiral.
For over a decade, Ray Kelly has been fighting police misconduct in Baltimore. Part of that work is collecting stories from residents about their interactions with the police and asking what their idea of reform is.
When we've asked people, do they support the Defund the Police movement, over 80%'s immediate answer is no.
Wow.
We need more police. It's a shooting every day. We need to just make the police do their jobs.
It could be kind of surprising that people in Baltimore would want more police. The city's had very public issues with corruption and misconduct in its department for years. In 2015, Freddie Gray died while in police custody, leading to massive protests in the city.
Freddie! Freddie! No justice! No peace! No racist! Police! See this? The world watching y'all. The world. Freddie Gray!
Gray's death brought the Justice Department's attention to Baltimore. After a multi-year investigation, they found that police conducted unconstitutional stops and searches, discriminated against Black residents, and used excessive force regularly. BPD was placed into a consent decree in 2017, putting them under federal oversight until they fixed the problems. But progress was slow, as scandal and corruption within the department continued to make headlines.
George Floyd! Say his name! George Floyd! Say his name!
After George Floyd was killed in 2020, local activists used the national momentum to push the city council to cut $22 million from the police budget. But the federal monitor said the cut was in violation of the consent decree agreement. So a year later, the city replenished the budget and then some. Even after all that, Kelly hasn't given up on defunding the police. So for now, he's working to loop the community into the budgeting process.
I think after explaining the concept of Divest, Invest, everybody, 100% of the people we talk to feel like the city doesn't invest nearly enough in education.
Do you think divest, invest is a better term to use than defund? Do you think defund has just become this term that people are afraid of?
Defund was immediate. Defund was the immediate response because people were fed up. And I think that was just a word to create the contention that leads to a conversation. We've been talking divest, invest for decades. So the deal for us in this community is we don't want to invest more in the police so we can arrest more killers in our community. We want to have less killings in our community.
The summer of 2020 saw people across the country fighting against racial injustice. It seemed like if there was ever going to be meaningful police reform, that was the window of opportunity to make real change. Democrats in the House went on to pass a bill named after George Floyd that called for a national ban on chokeholds, no-knock warrants, and eliminated qualified immunity. The bill was authored by Congresswoman Karen Bass.
I am hoping that out of the tragic death of George Floyd, that this country will recognize that we have a problem in policing.
But a year later, lawmakers couldn't come to a compromise in the Senate, and the bill died.
This time, we said simply this: I am not going to participate in reducing funding for the police.
While negotiations were going nowhere, crime was going up, and public sentiment moved away from defunding departments. Not only that, the issue that started this whole movement, police killings, continued to increase. But Democrats still pivoted hard towards more funding.
We should all agree the answer is not to defund the police, it's to fund the police.
Congresswoman Bass is now running for mayor of Los Angeles, where she's calling for an expansion of the LAPD. When we reached out to her to discuss her new stance on police reform, her team requested we focus on crime prevention rather than the George Floyd bill. After we said that our questions would include the bill, they agreed to an interview, but then never responded to multiple phone calls and emails. LA and Baltimore are two of the many cities that cut their police budgets in 2020, only to increase spending the following year. And these budgets are continuing to go up. We're heading into City Hall for a budget meeting where the Baltimore mayor is expected to announce a $5 million increase to the police budget, which will bring the total to $560 million for 2023.
We spend more per person per capita than Washington, D.C., New Orleans, New York, St. Louis, and Chicago, and yet have a lower ratio of police to residents. Why is it so much more expensive to police in Baltimore? I ask you again, why is it so much more expensive to police in Baltimore?
I have been reading the same testimony for the past 4 years. I do not support this year's preliminary budget. We continue to spend too much money on policing in our city. The city's spending should reflect the values and needs of the communities we serve.
Despite activist frustrations, the fact remains that police are here to stay, and cities are paying more money for more of them to hit the streets. So we wanted to see if years of protests made any impact on how cops view their own jobs.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, sir.
Everything's recorded, so something that happens here on the street takes 4 or 5 seconds. You roll up and boom, things just start happening and you made your decision. It could impact every police department in the country, every officer in the country for years to come.
Once you get your shotgun, walk down to the 10-yard line to your target assignments. Don't forget, before deploying the less lethal shotgun, always shout, beanbag being deployed, beanbag, 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 or less lethal being deployed. Shooters on command to fire. 1 round. Left forearm, green zone. Fire!
Beanbag, beanbag, beanbag!
What was that like, still making the decision to want to be an officer during this time when there's calls for reforms and things like that, especially after 2020?
It's a really precious time in a way to be trying to do something better. Every instructor that you come across will tell you that, like, it's all about being better, you know, even down to acknowledging all the wrong that has been done.
To, implement a certain change, you have to be the change. You can't just expect what's out there to just change automatically. You have to have a whole bunch of good officers coming in, and that's what we have now.
At this time, I would ask Captain David Burst to join me. I will administer your oath of office.
Not only is there a whole new wave of people joining the force, the BPD got a new commissioner in 2019 after the previous commissioner resigned and was indicted on tax fraud. So what have you done so far to change the culture here in Baltimore?
It was a big challenge to make sure we had the right leadership in place and to accept where the department is going, which is 21st century policing and not this old militaristic, authoritarian warrior mentality and way of thinking. It really has shifted culturally to a guardian way of thinking and mentality.
What is it like hearing community members go up to the podium and talk to city council members and the mayor about divesting funds from your department and putting it into those things that would prevent crime like poverty, mental health, addiction services, and things like that?
So the way I see that is at some point, we can have a conversation about, is our department too big, too small, or is it the right size? Once we build up all of the entities who can handle addiction, homelessness, mental illness, and all of the things people want to invest in and don't want police handling, but until that is built, there's no one to hand it off to.
Where do you think the money or investment or funding for those new programs should come from, if not from the police budget?
Well, that's not for me to say.
As activists argue.
They think I have extra money. There's no extra money. There's either pay the officers we have or fire the officers we have.
Since the death of George Floyd, do you think there's been any progress nationally as far as policing and use of force and things like that?
Well, I think there has been. And I think your extremely informed and progressive police chiefs and policing leaders are embarking upon reform. Now, we were forced to do it. Mm-hmm. So were we when I was in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. But many departments are not forced to do it, and they're slow doing it, and it is hard changing culture.
On that note, Commissioner, there's reports that say that police killings were actually up in 2021, probably one of the highest years in the last few years. What will it take to kind of end this cycle of Breonna Taylor's and George Floyd?
Well, what I don't want to do is answer that with the context that they're all unjustified or they're all wrong. What I will say is that it requires more training. We're doing that, and most departments are moving in that direction to move away from those things that other healthcare professionals should be and other social workers should be working on. Those things we shouldn't be dealing with, because many of those things are the reasons why we got into the uses of force in the first place. We were actually handling something somebody else should have been handling.
How do you measure success when it comes to progress?
Well, the easiest thing people want to look at is whether or not you can reduce crime. But crime is not always related to police, because crime is based off of decisions other people make. People who are solving conflict with gun violence because they lack the ability to solve it the right way, because they have deficiencies in their education, their housing issues are so bad, their addiction issues are bad, their mental illness is an issue, and it really has not much to do with law enforcement.
Ironically, one thing the commissioner and Kelly agree on is that police don't necessarily prevent crime. Even with a higher budget, Baltimore is on track for one of its deadliest years on record. And that's the thing. It feels like we keep moving back and forth between wanting more cops to keep our streets safe and being horrified by the next police killing.
The majority of people perceive the police as the entity designated to keep us safe. And that's what they lean on at election time when there's 10 homicides in the area in a weekend. That's a police problem. They're not thinking that the police job is to catch the perpetrators. They're thinking that we got to get police to stop this. And they never stop this. That's not what they do.
Do you think that's one of the issues with the defund movement, though, that it is kind of, like you said, if people are so conditioned to having police in their neighborhood, and on paper it makes sense to say if we invest in all these other programs and lower crime, then you won't need so many police. But until it actually happens and you can like show people for 10 years that this is the way, then you can't prove it, you know? And if nobody's doing it.
That's what my research in the past year showed me, that this is a long game.